Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to spend a few words on the Blon BL-03 version 2. In case you caught my video yesterday, I basically had the wrong tips on my Blons, and if you read anything about them you'll know that the fit is super difficult to get right. So I had some MH755 tips on it, and they were doing really crazy things to the sound. And there was a commenter, Mr. Blue, whose infinite wisdom said, yeah, you probably had the wrong tips. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I went back and put some KZ star tips on it. And now everything is as it should be. And I take back a lot of what I said yesterday. Not all of it. Some of it I think I was actually right about. But thank you, Mr. Blue, for helping me out with that one. And so let's start over again and say, so these are the Blon BL-03s. So different tips. The tips that come with it are no good. They're kind of silicone thin. They don't really seal at all. The cable, I wasn't a super fan on. You could actually see it over there. It's a really black thin cable with a sort of QDC connector on it. So this is 16 core copper straight 2-pin, working for me at the moment, so I'll probably keep it until something else comes along. But you can see super shiny, nice metal finish, kind of striking to look at compared to if you're used to resin, blue translucent resin earbuds. But so cool. So that's that. So let's talk about the sound of these guys. Well, first I'll say on the tips, so yeah, I had the wrong tips on it. And if you actually go through and research what other people had said, was if the nozzle is actually a little too thin or too small, it does really strange things to the sound. And that was what I was sort of experiencing. Was I was getting monster bass, but the mids were like super recessed. And not on every song, but like every other song. I couldn't figure it out. It was super strange. But yeah, if you go back and look at it, you'll see that people say can't be too small. And the other thing you can do is there's a tape mod to it. Put a piece of tape, which I'm going to go look into, to increase the bass a bit, which is sort of my problem now. Is I went from monster bass to not really enough for me, but that's kind of a personal thing. But so the word of the day on the Blons is probably going to be neutral or natural. The tuning is very neutral, except for maybe the upper mids. This whole thing, the way they tune this thing is instruments are supposed to sound like instruments. Claps and crashes and all these things that, especially the ZSX doesn't get perfect, sound very organic and very natural on the Blon. And that means that everything else sounds neutral as well, which isn't really my favorite tuning. But if you go into buying these with that understanding that certain musical genres are gonna appeal to that tuning more so than others. So we'll kind of get into that in a bit, but let's kind of work our way down the list of songs and features that I thought were kind of outstanding on the Blon. So, as I said, very natural sounding instruments and sounds and other weird things like that you don't notice with other earbuds. So I'll call it crashes, claps, and snaps. All those weird, snaps in songs that sound okay, they sound amazing, probably better than anything I've ever heard on this. And I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but it is what it is. So there's a song called Cole's Memory, which is from a movie with Zac Efron called We Are Your Friends, where he was a DJ. And he throws together this song from, samples from his experience that summer. And in that is a clap. And I've heard this song, 1,000 times. The clap is better here than I've ever heard it anywhere. Odd, yes. True, yes. Other thing that Blon is that people have been talking about are the cymbal crashes. So Dreams Fleetwood Mac has this opening cymbal crash a few seconds into the song. Again, I talk about it a lot. It's kind of a good test for, are you rich on the treble side or not? Probably the best cymbal crash I've ever heard with anything that I have in my collection. I don't know if they tuned this thing just for cymbals or what, but it is bizarrely realistic cymbal crashes, and it's kind of generally like that as well. I just kind of pulled out that song. Parallel Line by Keith Urban kind of shows two things which I think work really well in the Blonde. One, male voices. That lower vocal just worked for me a whole lot better than the upper vocals, and we'll get to that in a bit. Second, he has, I don't know if it's a tambourine. It's an acoustic song, but there's some metallic, smaller cymbal thing. I think it's a tambourine, and I almost never notice it on any other earphone, on my desktop speakers, and even today I went back and I'm like, listening to it on my desktop, I'm like, I just don't even hear it. But on these guys, it comes through kind of loud and clear, and it sounds like a musical instrument. It doesn't sound like, a steely piece of banging on metal. It sounds just as it should. Supernatural. Never noticed it on any other earphone, and it kind of caught my ear last night. Snaps. Grandma's Hands is on the Chesky demo disc, and for mid-range purity, he kind of calls it out and says, this snapping should sound exactly like you snapping in a room. And man, it does. It's freakish how good it sounds compared to, all the other times I've listened to that same song on different earphones. So crashes, claps, snaps, some amazing natural sounds can come out of this guy. So Soundstage, and you're probably looking, what do you mean Justin Bieber? Yeah. So don't kill me on that one, but not necessarily Soundstage in how wide it is, but listen to this song, and it's not actually this song, but what I kind of notice when I'm listening to this song is the Soundstage is different on the Blonde than I think almost anything else that I have. It's kind of being in Justin Bieber sort of right in front of you, like front row. He is just right there singing, very intimate, and the instruments are subtly to the side and to the back. They kind of melt away. It is totally wild, the illusion that this thing creates. And it's not like, he's singing in a big hall or something like that. It's just the intimacy of where his voice is coming from and how subtly to the side and sort of to the back where the instruments come from. And it's kind of an amazing thing to hear. And after I played his song for a while, and I started noticing it over and over again, how wild the Soundstage is. Very much different than the ZSX, which is really good, but you don't get that it's almost a depth, sort of. It's kind of hard to describe it. I just sort of describe it as it was the illusion of him singing in front of me versus the instruments sort of in the back, all playing a show the way it all should sound. Again, natural, yeah, it was sort of realistic and natural in a weird way. So Orinoco Flow by Enya is kind of an old-time new age song if you're into that. What's different about this guy is her vocals don't come from the center in front of you. A lot of especially the beginning of the song, her vocals are off to the side. So if you want to kind of get a sense of how wide the Soundstage is, it's kind of an interesting one to listen to. If you really want to know how wide the stage is, Sweet Georgia Brown by Monty Alexander on the Chesky demo disc. That's his visceral impact song. And so he talks about it saying, well, the stage is actually really wide. There's a lot of members of the band, and instruments sort of playing left to right, and the instruments take turns. There's 2 drum kits, 2 basses, and this whole thing is kind of moving in your head across this wide soundstage. And yeah, that one will blow you away, because I've never heard an earphone that wide. So when people say the Blon is super wide, there's a couple songs where I say, yeah, that is probably the one song where you really get a sense of how wide it can be, kind of just on a normal song, without doing like a mastered, this is supposed to sound like you're in some monster hall. Yeah, I was kind of blown away with that one too. It's I've never heard the 2 drum kits that far away from each other on any other earphone. It was kind of startling how wide they were. So another one from that Chesky, Britain's Festival de Tomb from the Westminster Choir, holographic imaging. So if you actually want to hear how well the Blon kind of represents or reproduces a big hall, and more so the height, the width. I mean, the width, you kind of feel the width, but the height and actually hearing songs from above, or the voices from above, I mean. I don't know. I don't have a pair of super expensive headphones. I assume it sounds better with those, but as far as, an earphone giving you a sense of height in the soundstage, that was a pretty good example of it. Okay, yep, Skid Row and hairbands. So kind of what I said about Justin Bieber kind of applies to this. If you actually listen to these guys on like your average headphone, the way they, it sounds like they were mastered in their garage, literally. They're horribly congested. And so what the Blon actually does is, so you get this, what I meant is you get the singer kind of dead center, and then the instruments are separated. There's a good bit of space to the guitars. So it actually opened up a lot of these really crappy sounding songs. So yeah, I noticed it. I played Skid Row a few times. If you've got it in your playlist, give it a shot. It's a new way to listen to some poorly mastered music. And if you're into that, then it sounds actually pretty good. But would I recommend hairband metal for a neutral sounding earphone? Probably not. But I noticed it. It kind of stuck out at me. So the other thing you notice about the Blon is there's a couple contradictions which are odd. So the bass, and you actually hear this in Cole's Memories, there's this really warm bass tone that goes through, and it's kind of warmish, and natural is one word for it, but neutral is probably what I was going for. But you combine that with some raised upper mids. Like, I think the mids probably raise a little too soon for me anyway, to sound natural, or to maintain the neutrality or naturalness of it, whichever you want to call it. So I call it the Sam Smith problem. He sings in that upper register, and if you push him up just a little bit, it doesn't sound like Sam Smith anymore. It's too high. And so I call that the Sam Smith problem. So on one hand, you've got this warmish bass, and that warm, I think warm is pretty generous. When you combine this, I think the raised upper mids actually override any warmish here, and I wouldn't necessarily call these warm. I think I'm kind of more on the treble is not even cold, but it tries to maintain its neutrality, and so it's not really pushing in either way, except for these upper mids. I thought that's sort of where they broke the neutrality a little bit. But so that sound signature, a neutral sound signature, very natural sounding instruments, super adapted to jazz, right? That's kind of exactly the sound signature that you want. But the weird thing is the bass decay is a little too slow for jazz. And I didn't write it on here, but there's actually a Chesky bass resonance, or there's a test for how fast your bass is. And it actually doesn't do really any better than the ZSX does. There's still some problems when they're really plucking the strings on the bass. So it's kind of odd that this whole thing is tuned towards a really beautiful jazz reproduction, but then the bass isn't quite there. And maybe that was a trade-off doing some of the other things that they do, but I thought it was kind of odd that the one genre where this thing is absolutely targeted towards didn't do the bass not quite as precise and not quite as fast as it should have been to really stand out for that. So yep, odd contradiction there. So again, so this neutral, natural sounding instrument thing isn't necessarily my cup of tea. I'm definitely more pop music, dance, even rock music is kind of my thing, and not necessarily the tuning that you would pick for any of those. So that, especially on the bass side. So like I said, it's got a pretty good punch. The mid bass is actually punchy. The sub bass is kind of way too, I don't know, I want to say recessed, or there's just not enough rumble there to really satisfy anyone on the dance side of it. And I understand it. You know, it's not always the most natural thing to let the decay go out, you know, slow it down, let the thing really rumble, so the bass notes of dance music sort of all not run together, but they're sort of continuous. That is not necessarily what they were going for. So for my personal preference, I would put these behind the ZSX, because simply the tuning is different on the ZSX, and it's more in line with what I listen to. But, you know, do you get these things on the ZSX? Does the ZSX do jazz as well as this guy does? You know, probably not. And if that's your cup of tea, then you should definitely look at this guy and pick it up. I mean, like I said, it was $28. I think I bought it at $27. I mean, it's sort of an unbelievable value for just being able to hear, you know, an earphone reproduce some of these sounds as natural as it does. It's kind of a treat for me. I talked about it yesterday in my first video. It's sort of an audio geek kind of thing. Like, I don't have anything else that sounds like this, so I was sort of geeking out on how a lot of these things sound compared to just enjoying the music. So that's my take on it. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.